They're not human.
There is a road, a shortcut through the hills.
Someone took the spikes off the road.
They're not going away. They're food.
No!
The wind swept through the desolate wasteland, carrying dust across the cracked, sun-scorched ground. The old mining town stood in silence, its skeletal remains buried under decades of neglect. A once thriving settlement, now reduced to abandoned structures, crumbling under the weight of time. Somewhere in the distance, the faint crackling of a Geiger counter echoed, a sound no one wanted to hear. Dressed in thick hazmat suits, a team of scientists moved cautiously through the contaminated landscape, their boots kicking up dry, irradiated earth. The leader, Dr. Calloway, adjusted his mask and squinted at the radiation detector in his gloved hand. The numbers climbed higher with each step. "Levels are spiking again," Calloway muttered, his voice muffled through the suit. "This whole area should have been off-limits," another scientist, Riley, responded. She scanned the distant hills, unsettled by the eerie stillness. "It's been decades since those tests, but the radiation's still off the charts. The government covered this up for a reason." "Yeah, well, they always do," Calloway sighed. "Let's wrap this up and—" A rustling sound cut through the wind. The group turned toward the source, staring into the emptiness beyond the cracked asphalt road. The hills were nothing but jagged rock and dry brush, bathed in the last light of the setting sun. "You hear that?" Riley asked. "Probably just the wind," Calloway dismissed, though his grip on the detector tightened. Then it came again, a slow, dragging sound. One of the team members, Carter, took a cautious step forward. His visor reflected the dying light as he peered over the ridge. Could be a coyote or... The world erupted into chaos. Something massive lunged out of the darkness, moving faster than anything its size should. Carter didn't even have time to scream before a rusted pickaxe buried itself into his chest. Blood sprayed against his visor as he collapsed to the ground, convulsing. "Jesus Christ!" Riley screamed. A second figure emerged from the rocks, grotesquely large, its deformed face barely human. It grabbed another scientist by the head and twisted. Bones snapped like dry twigs. The remaining team members scattered, stumbling over the uneven terrain, but they were outmatched. Their suits slowed them down, while their attackers moved with terrifying speed. Calloway sprinted toward the van, fumbling for his radio. "Mayday, we are under attack. I repeat, we are under..." A hulking figure tackled him from the side, slamming him onto the gravel. His visor cracked, and before he could react, a jagged knife tore through the fabric of his suit. His muffled scream gurgled as the blade twisted inside him. Riley kept running. She didn't look back. The van was only a few yards away. If she could just... A shadow loomed over her. A massive hand clamped down on her suit and yanked her backward. She thrashed violently, but the mutant holding her was too strong. "Please," she gasped, her voice cracking as her mask was torn away. "We don't mean any harm." The mutant cocked his head, amused by her pleading. Then, without a word, he slammed her head into the side of the van. Blood painted the metal as her body crumpled to the ground. The silence returned. The only sounds were the labored breathing of the hulking mutants and the rhythmic beeping of a Geiger counter still clutched in a lifeless hand. The leader of the group, a monstrous figure with a burned face and jagged teeth, stepped forward. He gestured toward the bodies. "Load 'em up." The others obeyed without hesitation, dragging the lifeless scientists to the truck parked nearby. The bodies were tossed into the back, arms and legs tangled in unnatural positions. The leader took one last look at the wreckage before climbing into the driver's seat. The truck roared to life, its headlights cutting through the desert darkness. As it rumbled forward, the bodies in the back scraped against the rusty metal. The road ahead led to an abandoned mining town, its broken buildings barely visible in the moonlight. At the edge of that town, a lone gas station stood. Inside, Fred awoke with a jolt. For a moment he sat frozen, his old heart hammering in his chest. Something had woken him, a noise outside. He listened, holding his breath. The desert was never truly silent. The wind howled, insects chirped, and somewhere in the distance a coyote yipped. But this was different. This was something else. With a tired groan, he swung his legs off the bed and reached for his shotgun, his fingers tightening around the familiar grip. He stepped outside, the cool night air stinging his skin. The gas station's neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the pumps. He squinted into the darkness, searching for movement. Nothing. Fred exhaled, shaking his head. Damn imagination. He turned back toward the door. And then he saw it. A bag sat on the doorstep. His stomach twisted. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. His throat was dry as he croaked out into the night. "I don't want to do this anymore." The desert remained silent. Fred hesitated, then with a resigned sigh, bent down and picked up the bag. He carried it inside, his hands shaking. The zipper slid open with an eerie finality. Inside there were watches, wallets, pieces of clothing, random things. But at the very bottom, nestled between a pair of cracked sunglasses and a blood-stained keychain, was a plastic container. Fred's breath hitched. He already knew what he would find, but when he unscrewed the lid and saw the severed human ear inside, he still recoiled in horror. His knees buckled and he sank into the chair, staring at the grotesque trophy. Outside, the wind howled through the empty roads. The truck was already gone, disappearing into the darkness, carrying its grim cargo toward the mines. The hunt had only just begun. The gas station stood like a forgotten relic in the middle of nowhere, its neon sign flickering weakly in the desert heat. The pumps were old, their paint chipped, their meters slow and untrustworthy. The building itself was even worse. Faded walls, a warped wooden porch, and a single dusty window reflecting the blinding sunlight. The Carter family pulled up in their SUV, the tires crunching over gravel as the vehicle rolled to a stop near the pumps. The engine hummed for a moment before dying out, leaving only the distant wail of the wind in the empty landscape. Doug sighed, rubbing his face. Why couldn't we just fly? Lynn shot him a warning look. Come on, Doug. Not this again. It's their anniversary. Yeah, and I still don't get why that means we all have to drive across the damn desert, he muttered. Be nice, she warned again. In the front seat, Bob opened the door and stretched his legs. His years as a detective had left him with stiff joints, and after hours on the road, he needed the break. Let's make this quick, he said, looking toward the station. We're already behind schedule. Ethel unbuckled her seatbelt, carefully maneuvering around the baby carrier where little Catherine slept. Brenda, their youngest daughter, climbed out next, stretching her arms above her head. It's so hot, she groaned. Bobby, the youngest of the Carter men, opened the back and let their 2 German shepherds, Beauty and Beast, jump out. Beauty darted forward immediately, sniffing the air, ears alert. Beast, always the calmer of the two, stayed near the car, his dark eyes scanning the area. Lynn walked over to Doug, giving him a playful nudge. Go stretch your legs before you start sulking. Doug sighed again, but got out of the car. He leaned against the door, eyes scanning the horizon. Nothing but empty desert and mountains in the distance. He hated places like this, places where no one could hear you scream. Meanwhile, inside the station, Fred sat behind the counter, staring at the bag on the floor. His fingers trembled as he wiped sweat from his forehead. The room smelled of dust, gasoline, and something else, something metallic. A bell jingled as the Carters entered. Bob approached the counter first. Afternoon, he greeted. We need to fill up. Fred looked up, startled. For a moment he hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Yeah, pump's still working. You can go ahead. Bob nodded and turned to head back outside, but as he did, Beauty slipped past him, her nose to the ground, tail wagging as she trotted toward the back room. Beauty, no! Bobby called, but the dog ignored him. Lynn followed her instinctively, stepping past the counter toward the open door where Beauty had disappeared. Hey, Fred barked. His voice was sharp, panicked. No dogs in here. Lynn froze, startled by his sudden outburst. She turned to look at him, and for the first time, she noticed how pale he was. His hands were shaking. His eyes darted between her and the back room, as if worried about what she might see. Beauty came trotting back, her nose still sniffing aggressively at the air. Lynn looked past her into the room. It was dark, cluttered, but something in there felt wrong. You okay, mister? She asked. Fred swallowed hard. Just get your gas and go. Bob re-entered, giving Fred a wary glance before calling out, Lynn, let's go. She hesitated, then nodded, leading Beauty back outside. Fred exhaled a shaky breath, running a hand through his graying hair. After a few minutes, as the Carters fueled up and stretched their legs, Fred stepped outside. He wiped his hands on his apron and forced a weak smile. Hey, you folks headed somewhere? San Diego, Bob answered. Fred nodded. Long drive? Tell me about it, Doug muttered. Fred hesitated, then cleared his throat. There's a shortcut, he said, nodding toward the hills. Not on the map, but it'll save you a couple hours. Road cuts straight through the mountains. Bob looked in the direction Fred pointed. It was just dirt, dust, and a narrow pass winding through the rocky hills. No signs, no pavement, just wilderness. "You sure?" Bob asked, skeptical. Fred nodded too quickly. "Yeah. It's a little rough, but it'll get you where you need to go faster." Doug scoffed. "A shortcut through the middle of nowhere? Yeah, sounds great." Bob ignored him. "Thanks," he said, offering Fred a polite nod. Fred gave him a tight-lipped smile, then turned back toward the station. As he walked, he muttered something under his breath. Something that sounded like, "I'm sorry." But Bob didn't hear it. The Carters packed up, got back in the car, and headed toward the hills. The road started smooth, but quickly turned rough, the dirt kicking up clouds of dust behind them. The hills rose around them like jagged teeth, casting long shadows in the fading sunlight. Doug stared out the window, shaking his head. "I still think this is a bad idea." "Relax," Bob said. "We'll be fine." But Doug wasn't convinced. And in the hills above, hidden among the rocks, someone else was watching. The trap was set, and the Carters had just driven straight into it. The desert swallowed the last light of day, draping the hills in thick darkness. The Carters were stranded, their SUV crippled by the shredded remains of its tires. The road, if it could even be called that, was empty, stretching back toward the gas station in one direction and forward into nothingness in the other. The wind howled through the craggy rocks, carrying whispers that could have been the voices of the dead, or something much worse. Bob and Doug stood near the vehicle, making a plan. "I'll head back to the gas station," Bob said, checking his revolver. "If I keep a steady pace, I should be there in a couple of hours." Doug exhaled sharply. "And I'll keep going forward, see if there's a freeway." Ethel crossed her arms. "Bob, are you sure about this?" "We don't have a choice," Bob said. The family gathered around as Ethel insisted they pray before the men left. Brenda sighed but folded her hands. Lynn rocked baby Catherine, whispering softly to calm her as the wind picked up, rattling the trees. High above, unseen, a pair of binoculars lowered. A hand, rough and gnarled, gripped the rocky ledge. The watchers in the hills whispered among themselves, their guttural voices lost in the night. The hunt had begun. Bob turned toward the station. Doug adjusted his jacket and walked in the opposite direction. Back at the trailer, Brenda leaned against the door frame, staring out into the darkness. "Well, this sucks." Bobby sat near the fire, gripping the handgun Bob had given him. His knuckles were white. He hadn't told them about Beauty, about what he had found out there. The torn flesh, the exposed ribs. He had barely been able to process it himself. A sharp bark pulled him from his thoughts. Beast. He stood quickly, heart pounding. The dog's growls rumbled low and dangerous. Beast was staring into the hills, his body rigid. Then he bolted. "Beast, no!" Bobby shouted, jumping to his feet. Brenda turned. "What is it?" "Beast ran off," Bobby said, already moving. "Bobby, don't..." But he was gone, vanishing into the dark. He climbed the rocky path, flashlight cutting through the trees. The ground was uneven, loose stones shifting under his feet. Beast was just ahead, barking furiously at something unseen. Then the barking stopped. Bobby hesitated. He could hear the dog panting, low and anxious. Then a sound, wet like something being torn apart. His stomach turned as he stepped forward. He lifted the flashlight. Beauty's body lay in the dirt. The flesh had been peeled back, muscles glistening under the beam of light. Flies buzzed in frantic circles around the exposed ribs. Bobby took a step back, bile rising in his throat. Then, something warm and wet dripped onto his face. He froze. Slowly, he tilted his head up. A hulking figure crouched above him on the rocks, its face barely human, eyes sunken and black. It was chewing, eating. It grinned. Bobby screamed. He turned to run, but his foot caught on a rock, sending him tumbling down the slope. His head hit something hard, and the world went black. From the shadows, a second figure stepped forward, a girl, small and sickly, her face deformed yet filled with something resembling concern. She knelt beside Bobby's unconscious body, touching his cheek with hesitant fingers. Ruby. She looked up at the one above, the one still gnawing on Beauty's leg. Goggle. No, she whispered. Goggle only laughed, stuffing another bite into his mouth. Down the road, Doug walked past the crater where wreckage lay half buried in the sand. Cars, buses, trailers, a graveyard of travelers who had come before. His flashlight flickered over shattered windshields, rusted license plates, personal belongings scattered in the dust. A baby doll, a shoe, a cracked camera. His breath caught. This wasn't an accident. He turned quickly, retracing his steps, heart pounding. Meanwhile, Bob finally reached the gas station. He moved quickly, stepping inside. The store was empty. The silence was thick, unnatural. The bag from earlier sat on the counter. Something was wrong. He moved to the back room. Newspaper clippings covered the wall, yellowed with age. Headlines jumped out at him. Government denies radiation poisoning claims. Families vanish after nuclear tests. Mysterious disappearances continue in New Mexico desert. Bob's hands curled into fists. He turned, looking for the old man. The bathroom door was ajar. A light flickered inside. Bob pushed it open. Fred sat on the toilet, bottle of whiskey in one hand, an old revolver in the other. His eyes were red, sunken with guilt. "I tried," Fred whispered, voice slurred. "Tried to help their kids. But they ain't kids no more." Bob stepped forward. "Where's my family?" Fred's hand tightened on the gun. "Run." The gunshot rang out and blood splattered across the mirror. Bob stumbled back, heart hammering. Then, outside, the voices began. He turned toward the door, gripping his revolver, stepping cautiously into the open air. The wind howled. Something moved behind him. Before he could react, a massive hand clamped over his face, yanking him backward. The world spun, his vision darkening as his head slammed against the truck's metal frame. A deep, rasping laugh filled his ears. Then, silence. Back at the trailer, Brenda paced. Bobby's been gone too long. Lynn stirred from where she slept, rubbing her eyes. "Huh? I'm going to look for him." Brenda stepped outside, flashlight shaking in her grip. "Bobby?" The wind carried no answer. Nearby, Bobby lay unconscious. Ruby sat beside him, staring down at him, conflicted. She knew what was coming. She knew what her family was going to do, and she wasn't sure if she could stop it. The first streaks of dawn bled into the sky, painting the desert in hues of rust and fire. The night had been long, filled with screams, gunshots, and the kind of terror that stripped a person down to their rawest self. Now only survival remained. Doug stood at the edge of the test village, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The buildings loomed before him, hollow, artificial homes built for nuclear experiments, their windows shattered, their furniture rotting. A ghost town, frozen in time, now infested with something far worse than radiation. In his arms, Beast growled low, his muzzle still damp with blood. The dog had already tasted vengeance, but Doug wasn't done. Not until he had his daughter back. The wind carried the faintest sound, a baby's cry. Doug's pulse quickened. He moved forward, creeping along the sides of the buildings. His body ached, fingers still slick with his own blood. He had lost 2 fingers to Pluto, had nearly been gutted by a mutant twice his size, but none of it mattered. Catherine was here, and he was taking her back. Inside one of the houses, a generator hummed weakly. Doug peered through a cracked window and spotted her, Catherine, lying on a bed, bundled in a filthy blanket. Beside her, a hulking mutant sat, sharpening a blade. Doug clenched his jaw. Big Mama. She wasn't like the others. There was something calculating in her milky eyes, something that suggested she had seen more than her share of bloodshed. She was rocking in place, muttering under her breath. Doug had to be smart. He took a step toward the door, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He spun, bringing the shotgun up, too late. The force of the blow sent him crashing against the wall, his ribs lighting up with searing pain. Lizard. Doug barely had time to register the mutant's wild grin before the knife came down. He twisted, the blade slicing into his shoulder instead of his chest. He howled in pain, but didn't stop. He couldn't. With everything he had left, he threw his weight forward, tackling Lizard through the rotted doorway. The 2 of them crashed into the house, sending furniture splintering across the floor. Big Mama shrieked, grabbing Catherine and retreating to the corner. Doug clawed for his gun, but Lizard was already on him, his knee pressing into Doug's chest. He grinned, raising the knife again. "Should have stayed dead," he snarled. Doug spat blood into his face. Lizard recoiled, and that second was all Doug needed. He drove his knee into the mutant's gut, forcing him back. Scrambling, he grabbed a broken chair leg and swung it with everything he had, cracking it across Lizard's jaw. The mutant staggered. Doug didn't stop. He grabbed Lizard by the throat, slamming him into the wall, punching him over and over until his knuckles split open. A gunshot rang out. Doug froze. Lizard had his shotgun. Doug barely had time to react before a blur of movement crashed into Lizard, sending them both tumbling through the open doorway. Ruby. She had thrown herself at him, tackling him just as he pulled the trigger. The gun went off, the blast ripping through the wall instead of Doug's chest. They tumbled, skidding across the dirt. Doug didn't hesitate. He grabbed the shotgun and leveled it at Lizard's head. The mutant groaned, spitting blood. "You ain't got the guts." Doug pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the valley. Lizard's body slumped, unmoving. Doug turned toward Ruby. She was crouched, cradling Catherine in her arms. You saved her," Doug whispered. Ruby didn't answer. She just looked at him, something unreadable in her expression before pressing the baby into his arms. "Go," she said softly. Doug hesitated. "What about you?" Ruby's lips trembled. She glanced toward the hills where shadows still lurked. "I can't go back." Doug wanted to say something, wanted to help her, but there was no time. A guttural roar split the air. Jupiter. Doug barely had a second before the massive figure of the mutant leader emerged from the ruins, his face twisted in rage. Doug turned and ran. He sprinted through the village, Catherine in his arms, his legs burning. Behind him, Jupiter thundered forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Doug knew he couldn't outrun him. He needed a plan. Up ahead, the test site, the remnants of the nuclear trials, fake houses, abandoned mannequins, rusted-out bomb shelters. And the generator. Doug veered toward it. Jupiter was gaining. Doug reached the generator and slammed his fist into the control panel. Sparks erupted. The lights flickered, buzzing wildly. Jupiter was right behind him. Doug dove to the side just as the mutant swung, his massive fist smashing into the panel. The generator whined. Electricity surged through Jupiter's body. The mutant howled, convulsing. Smoke curled from his flesh. Doug scrambled to his feet, grabbing a jagged metal pipe from the ground. With a final primal scream, he drove it straight into Jupiter's chest. The mutant shuddered. Blood bubbled from his lips. His massive hands twitched, reaching for Doug. Then he collapsed. Doug stumbled back, chest heaving. Silence. For the first time in hours, there was silence. He clutched Catherine tighter, his heart pounding. The sun was rising, painting the desert in soft golds and reds. He turned toward the hills. Brenda and Bobby stood there, waiting. The siblings rushed forward as Doug approached, their faces filled with disbelief, relief, horror. Brenda let out a choked sob. You're alive." Doug nodded, unable to speak. He handed Catherine to her, his body nearly giving out. They embraced, holding onto each other like they would never let go. For the first time since this nightmare began, it felt over. But as the camera pulled away, as the dust settled and the last traces of darkness faded, a figure stood in the hills, watching, waiting. The hunt was never over. The Carters had survived. For now.